Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today is July 12th, and we are talking, we're going to spend some time talking about today's solar eclipse. So there is a partial solar eclipse happening in the sign of Cancer, and it is about the 20th degree of Cancer with an opposition to Pluto in Capricorn. So it's a pretty exciting eclipse because it's rare that you see an eclipse so perfectly opposed to a sort of, giant transformational energy like Pluto. So I think this one has a lot of people pretty, excited, maybe a little foreboding nervousness around it because Pluto, most people who know a little bit about astrology know that Pluto doesn't mess around. So yeah, we have a number of themes here to think about. Let me turn off my phone so it doesn't go off. Here we go. So I have a list of things we're going to talk about today. Starting, I'll just give you a rundown of what we're going to look at as we explore today's eclipse. It's happening late tonight, early tomorrow, depending on where you are. So it's still technically the dark moon right now, but it's definitely a good moment to just take a look at this eclipse in advance. And oh, it's going to start the lawnmower across the yard. Hold on. Make sure you guys can't hear that going outside too loudly. Hope it's not too bad. How is it? Is it overbearing? Can you hear the sound of my voice okay? And the lawnmower, is it too loud? I'll wait till someone can. Okay, thank you. Awesome. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what eclipses are, very basically, what they imply. We're going to talk about how mundane astrologers look at eclipses. We're going to talk about how eclipses are read and studied in the personal birth chart. And then we're going to talk about this particular eclipse and what to expect from it, the themes that are involved with this eclipse, especially with the opposition to Pluto. And then we're going to talk about some practical ways that we can utilize or dovetail our utilize the energies of this eclipse or dovetail our spiritual life with the energies of this eclipse in order to grow. So a variety of things we'll talk about. All right, let's dive in. What are eclipses? Very, very basic. Eclipses mean that the light of the sun or moon is being occluded. So today is a solar eclipse, which means solar eclipses always happen on the new moon. And that means that if you, depending on where you're at in the world, an eclipse means that the disk of the moon is blocking out the light of the sun. On the other hand, you might have on a lunar eclipse, which always happen at full moons, you'll have the shadow of the earth passing over the face of the moon. But either way, you have the light of one of the two luminaries, the sun or the moon, being occluded or blocked out. And that symbolism is at the heart of what an eclipse means. Insofar as light is associated with growth and consciousness and clarity and things that we generally like, having the light darkened is something that has, throughout the history of astrology in general, has been signified or has signified some level of challenge, hostility, change, death, loss, grief, sudden turn of circumstance. Because when you lose light, you get a little bit lost. Or when something eclipses or shadows over the light, you may experience grief or loss or suffering, all of which are associated with the darkening of light. So that's one of the basic reasons why you can't necessarily polypositive your way around the general signification of eclipses. Eclipses are generally signs in God's good creation that a light is being darkened. And so that can mean a huge variety of different things, but there's always been a sense of foreboding around eclipses because of that. So that's where you start. Now, not everything that gets eclipsed in our life is necessarily bad. just like not everything in life that is represented by, not everything in astrology that represents growth and or abundance is necessarily good. For example, an eclipse might signal an event like the loss of something, for example, but the loss of something may be very good. A simple example might be that when somebody loses someone, or when somebody loses, let's say, their job, in either case, it is often the starting point of an inner transformation. So if you lose a loved one, sometimes it helps you to focus on the beauty of life, or it helps you to focus on what is eternal as compared to what is temporal and fleeting. On the other hand, any form of loss, in other words, can be a benefit to us on a spiritual level. So and also some forms of loss are just really good, like losing weight, or a tumor being reduced in size, or something like that. There are also moments where something being eclipsed could literally, in the material world, be a good thing. So you have some of those themes to think about with eclipses always. Something that's being occluded, something that's being blocked out, a change of circumstance where something is being darkened. With the sun in particular, at a solar eclipse, the sun as a source of light and clarity and guidance, as an astrological symbol, when it is occluded, it can represent the temporary loss of our sense of meaning or purpose or direction in life. And so on a very personal sort of psychological level, you can think of an eclipse of the sun as a moment where your guidance system is simply going through a period of redirection. And that can be in relation to any number of topics in your life, depending more precisely on where the eclipse lands in your birth chart. So, okay, so an omen of change, the eclipsing of light, think of it like that. Now, another thing to think about is that eclipses happen because the moon and the sun are lining up around what are called the nodes of the moon at the time of a new or full moon. And the nodes of the moon represent ascension and descension points between the moon and the path of the sun, sometimes called the ecliptic. So when the moon crosses and it is ascending above the ecliptic line of the sun, it means it's going into its more northern latitude, above the ecliptic line of the sun. It's ascending upward, and that's generally been associated throughout the history of astrology with the benefic planets Jupiter and Venus, because it represents increase and growth and gain, like that. But when the moon is descending, it's crossing that line in its monthly journey, and it's going down toward the south across the ecliptic plane of the sun and the sky, and it's descending below that plane toward the southern horizon. That's associated with the malefics, Mars and Saturn, which are, so the south node is associated with loss and decline and diminishment. This eclipse is constellating itself, or it's appearing with the north node of the moon. It's moving toward the north node of the moon. The north node of the moon is in Leo right now, about to change signs into Cancer, and south node is in Capricorn, about to change signs, or excuse me, Aquarius, about to change signs into Capricorn later this fall, at which point eclipses will start taking place regularly in Cancer and Capricorn. But until then, we still have 2 more eclipses this summer, July 27th and August 11th, happening in Aquarius and Leo. So eclipses come in sets like that. They move, and when an eclipse is constellated around the north node of the moon, there's generally a feeling of increase in the air, and the themes of Jupiter and Venus, growth, confirmation, abundance. But you have to remember, ancient astrologers had a saying that the north node of the moon increases both the good and the bad, and the south node of the moon decreases both the good and the bad. And this could apply to a planet in your chart that's conjoined to the north or south node in whatever that planet may signify in your chart, like your money or your spouse or something like that. But you're generally speaking, what you're looking at is also a kind of esoteric teaching about the nature of the nodes, which I've mentioned many times in previous videos. But it goes like this. Increase can be a good or a bad thing, and decrease can be a good or a bad thing. It's very contextually specific. Though generally speaking in the world, we subjectively prefer gain and abundance and increase in the satisfaction of our appetites and desires. The south node of the moon and decreases we also don't like as much because it's associated with loss and decline, and materially speaking, we don't like that. But there's ways in which increase isn't necessarily good and decrease isn't necessarily bad. As I was just saying, the same thing is true about eclipses in general. When we think of the occlusion of light, the occlusion of light isn't just about evil. It's about, you could say in a more general sense, it's about a transformation of circumstances that could be about increase or decrease. The node that the eclipse is associated with gives us a hint, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the increase will be good, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the decrease that may happen will be bad. Okay. Similarly, Indian astrologers have always told us that the north node of the moon, when you're concerned with moksha, which is spiritual liberation or renouncement or detachment from the material world, getting overly identified with material things, then the north node of the moon is particularly treacherous since it tends to increase material things. And the south node of the moon, though it decreases material things, is in some ways more auspicious for the sake of spiritual renunciation, meaning your spiritual life is increasing and your attachment to the material world is decreasing. So all of that being said, an eclipse is also about a change in fortune, a change in the circumstances of your fortune, meaning your karmic destiny in this life. Whether you're a Greek or an Indian astrologer, an Hellenistic Greco-Roman astrologer or an Indian astrologer, the basic thought was that the birth chart gives you some depiction of what your lot in life is. There's a certain quota that you're given of things, of happiness and dis-ease, and they come in different areas at different times. And they're not usually connected, they're not always connected directly to something that we can trace out. Well, like here's the cause and here's the effect and like that. Because these causes and effects are thought to come from a kind of mysterious preordinance that's divine in nature and that has to do with your karma or your soul's individual journey. And so the eclipses are also foreboding because they signal where there is light, especially with the sun. There is a sense of autonomy. There is a sense of choice and will and agency, a conscious individual entity with some sense of its own destiny and purpose. But when that light is eclipsed, there's a feeling of having lost control, of being out of one's agency. And so eclipses are also foreboding, generally speaking, because they often depict changes in fortune, where certain things that we are allotted in life are going to come. And often they come in a way that interrupts the flow of our destiny, or not the flow of our destiny, the flow of our choices. I'm going in this certain direction, right? That's what the sun is. You can kind of think about the sun psychologically like that. Like, I have agency. I'm going in a certain direction in life. I have a center of meaning, a sense of purpose and ambition, a sense of my own uniqueness, and I'm choosing a certain path in life based on how I have my own sense of calling. An eclipse comes and occludes the light, and suddenly it's as though that doesn't matter. Because there are things that are going to happen in your life that simply blot out your sense of agency and purpose and thwart your will or thwart your calling or whatever. In other words, even though we're born with a unique sense of destiny and will and purpose, not all of us get to accomplish it. Not all of us get to realize it. And even if we do, there are many obstacles along the way that come in and just interrupt us or act as major forks in the road, so to speak. So it's very important to understand that eclipses are also foreboding because they, surrounding the nodes and the ascent and descent of fortune, they represent times where allotted portions of fate or destiny are playing out in our lives, often in ways that completely interrupt our sense of agency, autonomy, free will, choice, etc. So there's always an interaction between choice and fate. There's certain things that are fated, and there's certain area of free will that you have. You can think about it, I've said this before too, as though you're born into a certain field of activities. A certain field of activities with a certain parameter. Within that field of activities, there are destined, allotted things that are going to happen, but you also have a certain amount of agency within that field of opportunities, or that field of destined events. So like, for example, and you can think about this very basically, I've said this before too, like a bird sitting outside my window has a field that's very unique to being a bird in the most basic sense, and then a field that's unique to it being that specific soul, right? And so its agency is operating within a particular field of opportunity and a field of limitations. Okay, so we're always like that all of the time. When eclipses come in, it's as though certain elements of the structure and boundaries of our field sometimes become more present to us. We feel and sense the limitations of our own power or our own will or our own, mojo in the world, so to speak. And people don't like that. Generally speaking, nobody likes to feel limited. Nobody likes to feel disempowered. And there are, of course, too many horrible examples of how we constantly thwart and disempower one another. So, eclipses have throughout history been associated with some pretty turbulent and foreboding themes. But if we bring spiritual consciousness into our relationship with these eclipses, they always stand as great opportunities for personal growth and perhaps for some inner healing and reflection, and for cultivation of some of our gifts and strengths, and lots of other opportunities that are within eclipses as well. We're going to get to those. Just briefly, in mundane astrology, this is the mundane astrologers study world events. And they look at things like eclipses and other celestial cycles, sometimes called synodic cycles of the planets. They'll look at different cycles in order to get a sense of where in the world certain kinds of events might be about to unfold. For example, you might, for eclipses in particular, a mundane astrologer may look at the element and sign that the eclipse is happening in, as well as perhaps the ruler of the sign, as well as the chart of the eclipse itself. At what moment is the eclipse perfecting, or during what hours is it happening, and what planets occupy the angles in what parts of the world simultaneously at that time. Those kinds of studies can lead us to saying, okay, this city in the world is going to be impacted very powerfully by this eclipse, or this particular elemental theme may be very pronounced. For example, when you go back to some of the medieval texts, you'll find things like if an eclipse is happening in a water sign, there may be waterborne diseases or illnesses or plagues or sicknesses. We have one in a water sign today, for example. When we had eclipses, I believe it was in Pisces. I can't remember where I read this, but it was when they were in Pisces that we had one of the places that was being affected very powerfully by one of the eclipses in Pisces, or a few of them in Pisces, was India, and we had a major outbreak of dengue fever, which is a waterborne illness type of situation, if I remember correctly. But I was reading anyway a mundane astrologer commenting on this, and so those kinds of details will be looked at in order to basically suggest where different kinds of things are going to happen. And again, I can't go too in depth into all of this. I'm also not an expert in mundane astrology or mundane eclipse forecasting, but the general idea is that you would study the details of the eclipses as well as where it's going to be perfecting, where it's going to be very visible, etc., and that'd give you some insight. Now, I'm going to read you something about today's eclipse that I found online. I believe this is a sky watching website, and it reporting on information from NASA. Solar eclipse scheduled for Friday 12th into the 13th. Most sky watchers will be out of luck without doing a bit of traveling. Truth be told, not many people will see this partial eclipse. We're talking about today's now. Thanks to its location, the moon's shadow will mostly fall over the open ocean waters that lie between Australia and Antarctica, the region where the Indian and Pacific Oceans merge. The people who will get a chance to see the moon take a small nibble out of the sun include those living in Australia and a portion of the territories of South Australia and Victoria, as well as those living on the island of Tasmania. Watchers in New Zealand on the southern tip of South Island, as well as on Stewart Island, and observers located on a slice of East Antarctica. Hobart, Tasmania will see about 10% of the sun's diameter eclipsed, while Melbourne, Australia will see barely a nick in the sun's disk, amounting to just 2.5% eclipsed. So the greatest eclipse, where only about 1/3 of the sun's diameter will be eclipsed, so the passing new moon, will occur on Antarctica near Peterson Bank, where an emperor penguin colony currently exists. Okay, so I thought I would just mention that. Why? Because I'm really here to talk to you about emperor penguins and their fate and their destiny. Oh, I'm just kidding. So, but that gives you a sense for those mundane details may figure prominently into the way in which an eclipse is forecasted. So you have an eclipse landing in a certain part of the world where it's more visible. Those places, the charts would be cast for those areas of the world, and you may see mundane events related to the eclipse in those parts of the world, perhaps more prominently because it's actually visible there. That's one line of theory anyway. So, but one thing that's very interesting to note is that when it falls in a water sign over Antarctica in a time where we are all growing more concerned with the changes to the environment and things like the what are they called? The ice shelves and the glaciers and things like that. Paying attention to water in a general sense right now may be a prominent theme that figures in a more global sense with this eclipse. And remember, again, by November, we're going to have the nodes moving into Cancer and Capricorn, which will signal more and more and more water-based eclipses. So that might mean that there are significance for the oceans, for ocean waters, for climate change and the water or the ice caps in particular. That could be a part of this, a part of what that's signifying. But I'm just trying to give you a sample of how mundane astrologers, the different kinds of details that they might look at, remembering again that I am not a mundane astrologer. So for us in modern natal astrology, what we want to do is look at eclipses in terms of moments of major personal transformation and change. And these personal moments of transformation or change within our own fields. So the mundane astrology is studying like the larger fields, like, okay, Antarctica or Southern Australia or whatever. Those are large fields with a lot of different, macro fields with tons of different micro fields within them, you could say. But when we're talking about our personal lives, we're talking about our personal field. Like the bird outside my window has its own personal field of activities, its own personal fate and destiny, as well as its own inborn abilities and limitations by being a bird. Similarly, our birth charts are giving us a picture of our own field of activities, our own fate and karma, as well as our own opportunities within that field or our own agency within that field to some extent. So when we're looking at eclipse personally, we're talking about, again, things that can eclipse us personally and create a transformation of circumstances, especially because the sun is a planet that has so much to do with agency. We're repeating ourselves here, but important to make the point once more. Our sense of purpose, our direction, our path in life can change dramatically as events happen and occlude our sense of purpose, destiny, freedom, independence, individuality. So there can be especially with Pluto, which we'll talk about in a moment, but there can be events like that happen, and how do we analyze those and understand exactly where and how they're going to happen? Here's a few basic tips if you want to look at your own birth chart. You will want to look at whether the eclipse is falling into, starting actually with Cancer. Where is the whole sign house of Cancer in your birth chart? Or if you use quadrant-based houses, then where does 20 degrees of Cancer, thereabouts, fall in your birth chart? If it falls on a house cusp in a quadrant-based system, the topics of that house are going to be really pronounced. If it falls in, if you're using whole sign houses, which I recommend, especially for major planetary events, look at the whole sign house and the topics therein. So if it's falling in your 11th, maybe friends or social circles. It's falling in your 10th, maybe career. It's falling in your 9th, perhaps something related to education or religion, like that. So look at the whole sign house and think, okay, the topics of this house are highlighted. That's the most basic core principle that I always start with when making an interpretation. If it's falling into an angular house in your birth chart, that is always significant as well. Angular houses in the ancient Greek language were sometimes referred to as kentrons. They're like centers of power. They're centers of activity. Why? Because they loosely correlate to the cardinal directions in the birth chart. The eastern horizon, where a planet makes its first appearance, the first house. The 10th house, an angular house, which is the sort of pinnacle of the sky, the place where the ecliptic reaches the highest point in the sky relative to the eastern and western horizon lines, the high point of the ecliptic in the sky. The setting place in the west, the western horizon, where a planet disappears. And then the 4th house, which is really the underworld, the roots of the chart, where a planet both reaches its anti-culmination point or its final resting point and then begins to rise again. So it was sometimes called the eternal, it was by some astrologers referred to as the beginning and end, the eternal base of the chart. So all 4 of those places are very powerful. They act as pivotal, transformational, like powerful hubs of activity. So if you have, if you have the eclipse in Cancer and it's landing in your 1st, 10th, 7th, or 4th, you can also think that eclipses around the angles tend to be a little stronger. And you should know the topics associated with those places. But in case you don't, 1st house would be like self and health and identity and character and new beginnings, initiating new things. 10th house might be related to your career, public reputation in some way, or authority figures. 7th house might be related to partnerships or love and marriage, for example. And the 4th house might be related to roots like home, family, property, etc. So look at whether or not it's falling in an angular house. And if you don't have any of this information, don't worry. We're still going to give some more very general information that should be useful to everyone. Now, the other thing is, think about any planets in your chart that are closely conjoined with 20 degrees of Cancer. If you have a planet that is within 3 degrees of 20 degrees Cancer, then you want to think about, the closer and tighter, the more powerful it will be. But that planet and the topical or natural significations of the planet, as well as the topical rulerships, can be highlighted. For example, let's say you have your natal Mercury at that degree. Well, communication, speech, and the mind might be especially emphasized under an eclipse that is conjoining your Mercury at 20 degrees of Cancer. However, Mercury may also rule your 2nd house of finances, in which case it's also possible that not only the natural significations like mind, speech, communication, but also the topics that it rules vis-a-vis the house that it rules in your chart, like the 2nd house of money, could also be activated. So looking at close planetary conjunctions is always a very basic thing that you can do that gives you actually a lot of information. Now, those are the basic things that I felt like I could deliver for you guys today that wouldn't be too advanced. There's other things too, like you could look at squares or oppositions to planets in your chart. Though remember, the general idea about aspects in astrology is that aspects have to do with lines of sight and visual rays of one planet in one sign seeing another planet in another sign. So you can conceptualize the planets as witnessing or seeing each other. That's what an aspect really is. An eclipse is about an occlusion of light, right? Not a ray of light that's being cast somewhere for the most part. So I'm always very hesitant in my own practice to go too bananas with aspects to other planets. The thing that I prioritize is if a planet in the chart is lined up with the eclipse, you can think about it symbolically like that planet is being eclipsed. But otherwise, I don't spend a ton of time looking at aspects from eclipses to other planets. That's my own sort of personal craft choice, you might say. But you certainly can look at aspects to other planets. I know plenty of astrologers and friends who do it all the time. So take that, or take that piece of advice or leave it. Now, this particular eclipse has a Plutonian theme. What is Pluto like? Well, Pluto is the lord of death and rebirth. So I have this. If you've never read it, make sure you read it, because it is one of the standards of our modern era of astrology. In my opinion, it's one of the greatest books of the modern era of astrology. So I really can't say enough about how beautiful and important I feel that this book is. It's called Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. And he has this beautiful way of describing Pluto in the text that I'm going to read you. Pluto, this eclipse, remember, this eclipse is opposite Pluto. Pluto is associated with the principle of elemental power, depth, and intensity, with that which compels, empowers, and intensifies whatever it touches, sometimes to overwhelming and catastrophic extremes, with the primordial instincts, libidinal and aggressive, destructive and regenerative, volcanic and cathartic, eliminative, transformative, ever-evolving, with the biological processes of birth, sex, and death, the cycle of death and rebirth with upheaval, breakdown, decay, and fertilization, violent purgatorial discharge of pent-up energies, purifying fire, situations of life and death, extremes, power struggles, all that is titanic, potent, massive. Pluto represents the underworld and underground in all senses, elemental, geological, instinctual, political, social, sexual, urban, criminal, mythological, demonic. It is the dark, mysterious, taboo, and often terrifying reality that lurks beneath the surface of things, beneath the ego, societal conventions, and the veneer of civilization, beneath the earth, the surface of the earth, that is periodically unleashed with destructive and transformative force. Pluto impels, burns, consumes, transfigures, resurrects. In mythic and religious terms, it is associated with all myths of descent and transformation, and with all deities of destruction and regeneration, death and rebirth. Dionysus, Hades, Persephone, Pan, Medusa, Lilith, Inanna, Isis and Osiris, the volcano goddess Pele, Quetzalcoatl, the serpent power, Kundalini, Shiva, Kali, Shakti. So, wow, that does it, right? It's like, oh, okay, so Pluto. so this eclipse is happening in a tight opposition with Pluto. So you have all of those sort of subterranean, cathartic, transformative energies, deep, intense, and potential to really get those qualities on board with the transformation that's already indicated by a solar eclipse in Cancer. So let's say, generally speaking, that we are being asked to transform. I've spoken. If you want to hear more in depth about Pluto and the Sun, check back in my videos on my YouTube channel, my website, nightlightastrology.com. And I have one called Previewing Summer Eclipses, and I have another one called Pluto Opposite the Sun. And you can hear me break the Pluto-Sun archetypes down in much greater depth. What I'm going to say today in general is that you're thinking about those transformative events that enter your field, that interrupt the light of your consciousness, your sense of agency, purpose, direction, that can just come in and sort of introduce a change or twist in the plot, maybe one that you weren't expecting, or maybe directly feeling like you're being blocked by the hand of fate. It can be, more extreme or less extreme. But if you're facing that and you're adding into it this Plutonian quality that says transform now, you must transform, then how can we how can we transform, or how should we meet and approach this energy so that we can continue to advance and grow spiritually, you might say. What is the best way to face a Pluto Sun opposition solar eclipse, right? Well, we have to look and be very honest with ourselves. Eclipses happen, but they don't, first of all, it's not like everything is going to happen today and tomorrow. A new moon eclipse is like the beginning of any new moon cycle. It plants a seed. And so the kinds of changes and transformation, the kind of thwarting or blocking of our will, a redirection of our lives in some way, different events within our field that are destined, all of that's going to start unfolding over the next 5-6 months. Eclipses take a long time to play out. They kind of have a way of intensifying, especially as planets will come over the eclipse points, or other moon cycles will wax and wane, and the successive eclipses to come over the rest of the summer come through, and then the eclipses start to roll in Cancer and Capricorn over the winter and so forth. So, you got, first of all, just give it time. It's going to take some time. So don't be too eager, even if you feel called to make changes in certain areas of your life, or if certain things pop up and introduce some kind of roadblock or obstacle for you. Don't feel like you need to make major changes right away, and don't feel like you need to have the answer to a problem or to know what to do with any kind of block that you're met with right away. We're always under the gun, aren't we? We're always feeling like, there's not enough time. There's not enough time to do everything. I should be doing everything. We rarely give ourselves enough true reflection and processing time to really sit with something. In fact, one of the things that I've noticed in myself is that sometimes I mistake a long time having passed, even since something happened with, well, I've had a while to process it. Did I actively take any time to process it, or has just a bunch of time gone by since something happened? Right? So actively processing something takes a little intentionality over a long period of time. We have to sit with something consistently, come back to it, journal with it, sit with it. And then over a long period of time, we can say we've processed something. A lot of the times, what stands as processing is not only just an artificial period of time going by, but during that artificial period of time, we've had very artificial ways of repressing or pushing out of our consciousness things that we are faced with in life, or choices that we have to make, or feelings that we have. And so instead of really dealing with them, we have, so we deal with them a little bit, and then we have a snappy response or a snappy answer, and we keep telling ourselves that answer. And then over a long enough period of time, we say, well, I've processed that. I've come to, I'm good with that. But a lot of the times, in order to really be processing something, we have to withhold judgment or decisions or actions for a long time, and keep coming back to thinking about it, and keep coming back to abstaining from making a judgment about the things that have happened to us, or the things that we're presented with, choices that we have to make in life. And I'm not talking about years here, but if an eclipse is rolling through your chart right now and there's big things changing around you, try giving it at least a moon cycle, and try to be intentional about sitting with what's happened. That's the first piece of advice. So oftentimes, one of the reasons that the obstacles that we face when we want to grow, and or we're faced with a limitation or a challenge of some kind, is that we tend to try for too much at once. So another thing is that when transformation occurs, we can get high on it. Especially because we tend to put so many things in our body and mind that, can amplify the sense of urgency. So an eclipse comes through, the seeds of change are planted, there's some challenging events around us, and we just rush into doing something because we get high on the sort of moment, and we say, okay, so you feel the changes coming, and you're like, oh my God, I love change so much. So I just want to jump into some new endeavor, some new activity. And we're not nearly patient enough in that regard either. So we try for too much at once sometimes with eclipses, rather than, again, giving them time. We try to process things too quickly rather than processing things in time. Um, we think also that where transformation is being required or demanded of us, or where we faced a block or a limitation or an obstacle of some kind, so we say, okay, we got the feedback universe, something needs to change here. And so then we set about to do a total overhaul of our lives, right? And oftentimes that fits right into the category of trying for too much at once. Why is it not a good idea to try to change everything at once? Even Eclipse might say, hey, there's some big things in your life that need to change. But if you try to do them all at once, here's what usually happens. You fail. The ego doesn't like failing, and so it goes back to something that's familiar that it can feel comfortable with and not have to feel like a failure about. And so biting off too much, even when an eclipse is telling you that major things need to change, not having a plan, not taking it little by little, not being patient with the transformation can also it can feed right back into the ego's desire to just say, well, I'm just going to avoid that. I don't have to deal with this at all because I don't want to be a perfectionist. But the problem with that is that okay, so talking about perfectionism, one of the main reasons that we stop trying to go, make some positive change in our life, or one of the main reasons that we resist transformation, is because it looks too daunting, there's too much, and we say nobody's perfect. And then the nobody's perfect becomes kind of a cop-out. We say, okay, I don't have to do anything, I don't have to make any changes because I don't have to be perfect. But we have to understand that the goal isn't perfection. So we have to understand, what is our end game here? Is the reason that we're transforming because we're trying to become perfect? Is that really the end goal? Is that our end game? Is that our philosophical highest standard, is personal perfection in this world, especially knowing that our bodies are going to die someday, right? That we're a spirit soul. If we do know that, then our understanding of what the goal of transformation has to change, and it's usually not perfection. The end game, we have to redefine the end game to be something that we see transformation in this world, in this life, in all the departments of our life being in service to. So, for example, I may need to change my diet, I may need to change my work or my employment situation, or I may need to change something about my relationship, or all of the above. There may be a whole menu of stuff that I could choose from that I need to make some changes on in my life. But it's not, in spiritual life, we are not making those changes because our goal is that once we make those changes, all of our problems will be solved. No. Basically, it's like this. Spiritual life is like a fire that you constantly have to tend and keep alive. You have to feed it constantly. The reason that transformations are needed in all different areas of our life is because all of the different things in our life that we can get stuck in or weighed down by are things that tend to take us away from tending to that inner fire, that inner warmth, that inner life and light. And so the transformations that we're undertaking in life are not about perfection. They're really about setting the stage in the right way so that we have a lot of energy physically and materially while we're in this body, in this lifetime, to tend that fire. So the goal isn't your weight. It's not your perfect relationship. It's not your perfect job. It's not about changing those details in your life so that they'll deliver something to you. It's about changing those things to be healthier so that everything is more streamlined to feeding right into that central fire of your inner spiritual life. And that inner spiritual life is thus conceptualized as devotional. It's about love. It's about loving yourself, finding the love within your heart, and also learning how to make all of your life a steady fire and one that is in service to the divine whole of which you are a part. So the goal is not perfection, but perfecting certain elements of our surroundings helps us to be more attentive to the divine source within us. And that, in turn, the goal of that is about being a servant. It's not about perfection. For example, you could say, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says that the people who spend a lot of time doing pious activities and becoming really good people, sort of in the mode of goodness, they may ascend to the most heavenly planets by spiritual evolution. They may take rebirth in planets that are very, very, very blissful. But he says, but from the highest planet down to the lowest planet, all are places of misery wherein repeated cycles of birth and death take place. So even the most heavenly planets in the material universe are thought to be temporary and not ultimately satisfying to us. But living a good life, being a good person, trying to obtain happier results by being a good person, that can help you advance spiritually to amazing realms within the multiverse. But those realms don't last forever. There's still a set amount of energy in any place in the material universe before the energy tends to entropy. And the cycle just keeps going round and round like that. So ultimately, Krishna's trying to, in the Bhagavad Gita, trying to reorient us. The purpose of spiritual life is not about transforming for the sake of greater happiness in a material sense. It's transforming your spiritual life so that the environment is more conducive to feeding all of your devotional love into the source that is in, but also beyond this entire material world. And when you do that, your number one concern is not about what rearranging your life in a particular way gives to you in terms of personal material comfort or satisfaction. It ends up becoming about the quality of your inner state, your inner consciousness, and its deepening intimacy with the source of which it is a part, which grants to it in all of its endeavors in the material world a sense of being a servant of the divine, which is ultimately the highest form of bliss that we could have. It's not goal-oriented, it's service-oriented. So when transformation comes up in our life through these eclipses, the lesson I want to leave us with today is just the idea is that getting eclipse can be an amazing opportunity to have our lives transformed, sometimes against our own will, but perhaps for the better. Perhaps letting go of things or being blocked or thwarted is a good reminder that we're servants here, not proprietors of our own personal happiness, that trip doesn't take us anywhere in the long run. So that can be a blessing. On the other hand, eclipses can be heralds of transformation, make changes. But remember what we're making it in service to, that the transformations are ultimately not for us. They're so that we can become deeper and more humble servants of the divine, which in return, its reciprocation is love. And that's the ultimate form of happiness. So that's what I have for today. It is it's my daddy-daughter day today, so I'm going to be with my daughter for the rest of the day. I'm pretty excited about that. I'll look up and see if there's any questions from you guys coming through. Speaking of daddy-daughter day, I'm about to be daddy times 2. Our second daughter's coming any day now, so my wife's due date is pretty close to the cusp between Cancer and Leo, so it should be interesting. I'm a Cancer sun, but my ascendant is Taurus with Venus in Leo, so it's possible that a baby born in Cancer or Leo would have some immediate resonance with my chart, so it's kind of exciting. Anyway, okay, let's see. Good morning, Jennifer. Oh, look, so many people here. Aaron and Becca. Hey, guys. Josh Hewlett. Wow, I haven't heard from you for a really long time. Glad to see you. And let's see. This eclipse is square to your ascendant. Okay, there you go. A Kentron party. Yeah, that sounds like the kind of party we should all want to hang out at. A Kentron party. Oh, Alma turns 10 today, Hannah. Wow, that's amazing. Tell her I said happy birthday. It's really exciting because my Cancerian friend, Tarnis, is brilliant. His daughter too. Yes, and Becca was here earlier. So if you're still here, you're brilliant too. That's what Deborah wants you to know. I think Becca's incredibly talented, and I've had her speak at my speaker series program, and will be very happy to have her back again. We were just talking about hopefully having her back maybe in the fall. And we were talking about maybe doing something on the Lord of the Rings and astrology, which would be really cool. Anyway, there is a sense of a window opening, and it seems time sensitive. This creates a sense of urgency for me. Oh, I see. Interesting. Yeah, that could be. I mean, urgency isn't always a bad thing. Lisa, my husband and I just had an argument about goals versus perfect. Ah, yes. You may have been on the wrong side of that one. Enjoy your day. What's your moon? Capricorn moon. I was born under a lunar day of a lunar eclipse. Holy smokes, this was wildly resonant for me. Have a beautiful day with your daughter. Thank you. Jai Krishna. Hey. Hare Krishna Ra. Donna says, thank you so much for this talk today. Exactly what I need at the right time. Beautiful. Cancer Sun, Scorpio rising here. Nice. Beautiful. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and I hope you all have a wonderful eclipse today. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about the lunar eclipse in Aquarius. Be sure to watch the news as well, because oftentimes the news around eclipses will teach you a lot about the study of astrology, and it'll give you a little bit extra to look at with the eclipse too. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.